afternoon. I hope you enjoyed lunch. With the elections fast approaching, we wanted our summit to focus on issues of equality. And we hope that these issues are on both voters and politicians' mind come November. So this next panel is going to discuss one of those issues, and that is redistribution. That's our taxation and spending by our national and local governments. These tools of redistribution can either alter or preserve women's economic status. And unfortunately, the dramatic changes to women's personal and professional lives over the last few decades and changes to our demographics in this country have not been reflected in our systems of taxation and fiscal policy. More on that in a moment. Professor David Kamen in the center will be moderating this important discussion. He brings a wealth of pertinent experience. First, from his time at the White House, coordinating tax and budget policies as special assistant to President Obama, to his work at the OMB, where he worked on the president's first two budgets. He's also worked on fiscal policy at both the Committee for Economic Development and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. He also has excellent taste in law schools. Welcome to the panel, Professor Kamen. We're honored to have you.
Great. So with that, now we'll introduce the more important people on the panel who are actually the panelists. I'll start off on my right with Ann Allstadt. Ann is the Bierman Professor in Taxation at Yale Law School. She's been at Yale since 1997 and has served in a number of roles there, including Deputy Dean. And she's there won a number of teaching awards, including the Yale Law Women Teaching Award 3 times. Before that, she has also taught at, would be more accurate, at Harvard as well as Columbia. Anne also served as an attorney advisor in the Treasury Department's Office of Tax Legislative Counsel. She has written broadly on issues around tax policy, including the taxation of the family. Her newest book, A New Deal for Old Age Toward a Progressive Retirement, will be published in March of this year. She has also released a number of other books, including No Exit, What Parents Owe Children and What Society Owes Parents, as well as The Stakeholder Society. Anne has a JD from Yale Law School. Next is Kitty Richards. Kitty is Chief of Staff to DC Councilmember Alyssa Silverman. Prior to managing the council members' campaign, Kitty worked on federal fiscal and economic policy at several think tanks, including we are both alums of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. She has also worked on Capitol Hill and also at the White House, where she was economic policy advisor to Vice President Biden. Kitty also has excellent taste in law schools and is an alum of NYU. Next is Joelle Gamble. Joelle is the director of the Roosevelt Institute's National Network of Emerging Thinkers and Doers. Under Joelle's leadership, the Roosevelt Institute has dramatically increased the number of student policy change efforts it supports. The network has also seen a marked increase in the racial, socioeconomic, and gender diversity in its national student leadership. Prior to coming to the Roosevelt Institute, Joelle is a student organizer in the University of California Student Association, worked on political campaigns related to tax reform and budgetary priorities. Joelle also writes on topics of race and economics, and her work can be found in a number of places, including The Nation, Salon, The Hill, and Huffington Post. Finally, on the far left is Julie Vochtman. Julie is Senior Counsel and Director of Income Support Policy for the National Women's Law Center. She works on a range of issues involving job quality and supports for low-income women and their families, including minimum wage and scheduling policies, child care assistance, and federal and state tax credits. She is co-author of the Center's 2016 report, Set Up to Fail When Low-Wage Work Jeopardizes Parents' and Children's Success. Prior to joining the Center in 2010, she served as she was an associate at Covington and Burlington, and she is a graduate of the Georgetown University Law Center. So, excuse me, so with that, we'll have Ann kick off the discussion.
So some of you may be wondering, what are a bunch of tax lawyers doing here? What does tax have to do with the kinds of things that Caroline talked about, with economic inequality, with child care policy and so on? Well, others of you in the audience already know that in the United States, more than in any other comparably developed country, the tax law is the site of, shall I say, what social policy we have. which is not an enormous amount, but it's somehow this unique American kind of anti-tax politics has resulted in and supported a system in which social policy is made via targeted tax cuts. So if you care about childcare, if you care about health care, if you care about supporting low-income workers, if you care about housing, about the environment, about retirement policy, and I could go on, you have to care about tax in this country because so many of the subsidy dollars, the redistributive, or I should say distributive dollars that go to these things go through the tax code. And so isn't it funny that we have put so much, so we've hidden really so much of social policy in this little field for experts. So we're gonna explain some of the mysteries of our little field and why it's so important. So I actually want to start by talking about three trends. So Lily spoke about this in her opening remarks. Three trends that have transformed work and family life for women and for men in the last couple of generations. Now, the outcome of these trends are known to you. You are living them. But the reason it's worth looking at the change in trend, why it's worth looking at how things used to be different, is that the tax law and American social policy have lagged, right? We have not fully, and in some cases not at all, incorporated a recognition of these changes in our law. And so I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to give some directions, what I take to be directions for change, and then the other panelists have a lot of really good thoughts about policy and so on. So there's a lot of data we could bring to bear. I'm just going to give you, I have 3 slides, that's all it is, and these are just little illustrations of the 3 trends. So the first trend is the decline of marriage. When Social Security and tax law were being written in the mid-20th century, there was a very, very convenient fact. And the convenient fact was nearly everybody was married, and nearly everybody's marriage had a prescribed and relatively homogeneous content. Okay? That's no longer true. So if you look on the left here, my first set of bars is the mid-20th century. The old stuff is blue. The new today figures are green. You can see the enormous rise in people that are not married. Many of these people have children. Many of them have partners. Many of them have been married, will be married later. But marriage is no longer it's no longer a convenient proxy for family. More and more, family takes place. The work of raising children, the work of caring for each other, the work of taking care of the needs of people with disabilities, of older people, and so on, is done very much outside marriage. Okay, and so, for example, another snapshot statistic, the percentage of children that live with a single parent or that live with no parents, meaning that they might live with a grandmother, or they might live with an aunt or uncle or something like that, and you can see the rise. So in both cases, the green bar is bigger by quite a lot, And so again, you guys have or will live some of these things, and yet, even in our federal income tax classes, what's the thing we teach about? We teach about the marriage penalty, right? And so the ways and so many social benefits in the tax code are in some way linked to marriage, which is just increasingly odd. I'll talk about policy implications in a minute, but let's go to the second trend. Whoops. Wait a second. Where's my second trend? I think maybe my slides. Oh, they just got out of order. No big deal. The second trend is what I want to call the changing face of gender inequality. In the mid-20th century, if you were concerned about gender inequality, what you were going to worry about, the people who were kind of your poster people for being economically vulnerable, were wives. Why? Because people were married for the long term, people were married young. Women typically would leave the workforce when they married. They often had not a lot of education before they went into marriage. And so the great risk was that their male breadwinner on whom they depended would die, become disabled, or leave them, right? And so if you were concerned about social policy and women in that era, you worried about wives. And you assumed that wives were non-working and that they were vulnerable when their connection to a man was broken. Now, all of this, again, total sea change. The lives you guys are living, that I'm living, are very, very different, right? So in the the upper left graph here, you can see the growth in working mothers. And this is of the group that is least likely to work, which is mothers of children under 3. This group of mothers is the least likely group of mothers then and now to work. And you can see the enormous change. We have about 60-some% of mothers of really young children. If you've had children, you know that under 3 is really young. They are working now, right? The family income ratio, this one surprised me, actually. I wanted to see, so, you know, one of the big changes, of course, is, that we saw on the previous slide, is the prominence of single motherhood now, right? The number of children that are being raised by single mothers, the number of women that both work to support their household and do this kind of care work. And I was kind of astonished by this. So what this is, this lower set of blue and purple bars here, is a ratio of the income of single mother families to married couple families. Now, you would expect that married couple families, you know, that the ratio would be under 1, right? Because you would expect that married couple families, they have potentially 2 earners, right? Especially now. So you would expect that their incomes would be higher. And indeed, even in the early 20th century, the ratio was about 50%. That ratio has fallen, meaning that single mother families are now poorer relative to married couple families than they were, you know, 50 years ago. And I guess I shouldn't have been surprised by that. Once you see the statistic, you understand why. It goes hand in hand with the rise of the working wife, right? So that when married couples have 2 earners, then their incomes, they've actually prospered in real terms, largely because the wives have gone to work. Single mothers had 1 earner, they have 1 earner, and of course, because women's wages are lower than men's, single mothers as a group are extremely low income compared to other family type groups. And so that's what we see there. The other graph actually has to do with retirement. You know, sometimes we think about economic inequality as a young person's issue. And I'm sorry to say it is very much a young person's issue. You know, I have 16-year-old twins, and so they're a little bit, 10 years younger than you guys are. But, you know, I worry about what economic life looks for your generation. I really, really do. You know, we in my cohort had the benefit of the Reagan boom, which was probably somewhat illegitimate, but we got it. You know, you guys are paying the price, right? You guys are paying the price, and there's so much less certainty and so much inequality. And yet, that inequality also cashes out at retirement. And so what this graph at the bottom shows is, again, it's very much the changing face of gender inequality. In the mid-20th century, the overwhelming number of women who reached retirement age would claim as wives, which is to say they would claim a Social Security benefit based on their husband's work history. And that was just the way it was. That claiming is going away. And it's going away for 2 reasons. One is that fewer and fewer people are married, so you see how the trends come together. Fewer and fewer people are married, okay? Those that are married for shorter times on average. People are remarried, and so on and so on. And of course, women are working. And so the result is that more and more women will claim on their own Social Security record and not on a man's record. Right? Not on a spouse's record, I should say, because thank goodness Social Security is now neutral across same-sex and different-sex couples. But these data happen to be for different-sex couples. That's the second trend, the changing face of gender inequality. The third trend, not the end yet, the third trend is cumulative disadvantage. One of the features of American society that has changed, and this goes right along with the story of increasing income inequality. But if you look beyond income to other features of life that make life worth living or that make life harder, okay? Increasingly, disadvantage is concentrated among the same group of people. So my recent book is on retirement policy, and one of the cool things about looking at retirees is their lives, you know, a big chunk of their lives have been lived. So you actually, you know, if you look at young people, we don't know what your lives are going to be, right? And we can take a snapshot of you right now, but that doesn't tell us what your lives are. If you're looking at somebody's 50, 60, 70, our lives aren't over, okay, but we've had a certain amount of time in the world, and so you can actually look, who's lifetime poor, and so on. And what we see in the data, more so than ever before, at least more so than in the mid-20th century, and probably more so even before that, is we see a divergence in life path. And so people who are relatively well off reach age 65, age 70, age 75, age 80, and they have what? They have pretty good, again, all these are averages. All these are averages. They have good retirement pensions. They have good health. They have low rates of disability. If they have disability, they can accommodate it, right? And often they're in these encore third life careers. At the bottom end of the income and wealth spectrum, you see something, a quality of life that's vastly different, right? So the same people who are low lifetime earners by age 50, 55, 60, 65 will have much higher rates of death, okay? Much higher rates of disability, much less in the way of wealth accumulation to supplement their Social Security. Often their Social Security benefits are quite meager, so although I'm a big fan of Social Security, it was not intended to and does not address the situation of this group of people, and so on. So you might say, well, wait a second. It's always been better to be rich than poor. It's always more fun to be rich than poor. Surely that's just a fact of life. What's really stunning is that the mid-20th century was not so much like that. Sure, there were some people who were richer and some people poorer. There was a little difference in longevity, let's say, but there's a much bigger difference in longevity today than there was then, despite all of the wonderful improvements, in medical care and so on. Those have gone to the top and not to the bottom. So there's actually greater dispersion. Greater dispersion in what kind of job options you have. Greater dispersion in disability and health. Okay, all right. So all of these facts, I'm gonna stop. David, am I over time? I'm on the borderline of over time.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just gonna say very briefly, what should we take from all this? How might we think about tax and social policy differently, right? What was the point of all these graphs? I mean, they're cool, but what's the point of them? So I think the first lesson I take is that we should be vigilant about having policies that don't favor the married over the unmarried. As marriage is now disassociated from family for so many people, and as the content of marriage has changed, it's no longer a convenient shorthand for family, for unpaid labor, for all the things that used to be a shorthand for. We really should be quite vigilant, and we can talk about specific policies, but the marriage penalty and the marriage bonus just cannot be the focus of women and tax policy anymore. That brings me to a second direction, which is we should take really seriously the situation of single parents and recognize that they are primarily, though not all, single mothers. And so these are, parents, mothers, who are bearing the burden of bringing in the bread, and they're also doing the unpaid work, very often all of it, right? So there are definitely, fathers out there and non-custodial mothers who are sharing joint custody and all that stuff. There's a really large number of fathers and some mothers out there that aren't doing anything, and so that you have, they're really out of the scene. And so you have this group of people who's working incredibly hard in the marketplace and incredibly hard at home, and yet they're doing it under the conditions that Caroline talked about, of no family leave, no paid sick leave, and tax policies that are really imperfectly geared to their situation. So there are a lot of ways that we could rethink the situation of single parents. Finally, and this is my last thing, David, so I will quit the stage, on this problem of cumulative disadvantage, I think it needs to be attacked in two places. During the working years, when the disadvantage is accumulating, we could do more than we do. This has to do with the conditions of work. It has to do with the stress levels that people have in their workplace, their access to health care, their access to assistance for child care, all kinds of things. We could improve the quality of life during the working years, but we also have to take account of the fact that a certain number of people are going to get to retirement differentially burdened by cumulative disadvantage. And right now, the Social Security system, again, I'm a huge fan of Social Security, but I really do feel that it's outdated. The Social Security system right now pretends that everybody's equal in terms of the age at which they can retire, in terms of the percentage of their earnings that they need to replace, and the system also assumes that everybody's worked consistently at a consistent wage. Well, if you're a single mother, you are going to realize how darn hard it is to work consistently at a consistent wage. That's hard enough if you are educated, because children get sick, children need stuff. Guess what? They're human beings. But it's also, you know, if you're a low income single mother facing the kinds of things that Caroline talked about, you know, not enough work hours, no benefits at your job. You know, you may very well have a work history that's not going to get you a very good Social Security benefit. Why? Because you didn't act like a male worker circa 1950. Okay? So I'll stop with that.
Thank you.
Right. I think I'll stay seated if that's okay with folks. So I really want to build on a lot of what Professor Allstott said. First, I want to reinforce, while I'm in the room with a lot of law students, the importance of fiscal policy. I think when you're in law school, most of the classes you take really focus you on the regulatory schema that law creates, and those are very important. But even if you're focused on areas where you're learning about the regulatory rules, you know, it's very difficult to have good environmental protection without an EPA, and that requires resources. And I think that sometimes the importance of resource allocation can get lost. Total government expenditures in this country are about a third of the economy. In other developed countries, they tend to be higher. Those expenditures and the taxes that raise the revenues, as Professor Allstott was saying, also have big effects on economic activity sort of outside of the government spending. You know, if you think about simple things like deciding to build a road to this town instead of that town, or dredge this port instead of that port, those have huge effects on the distribution, the geographic distribution of economic activity. Research and development, you know, we have these wonderful microcomputers now, largely thanks to research that was done in the military and in NASA. We haven't solved malaria. These are priorities that we set through our government spending. And these priorities have huge effects on the distribution of wealth, on the distribution of economic opportunity, on our family structure and the way that we view it in our society, and on workplace policies. So tying to the kind of demographic shifts that Professor Allstott was talking about, I'd like to focus on sort of how we make decisions about what is a kind of private problem that needs to be dealt with by individuals and families versus a public problem that's something that we band together with our government and our resources to solve. And I think that I wrote down that you get penalized for not acting like a male worker circa 1950, but I think that we really have constructed a labor force policy regime, including in fiscal policy, that takes this very narrow view of what a worker is. And honestly, as we've heard from other speakers, it's a view that was never really historically accurate, but was probably more historically accurate in an extremely narrow portion of the post-war period, basically. And I want to focus on a particular issue which in the tax nerd world we call home production, but which the rest of you would call childcare and cooking and cleaning and all of the things that have to be done at home in order for workers to work and parents to parent, and the way that we have approached that in our fiscal system. So we've heard one of the things that's really important is that, you know, now there are a lot of folks working in these fields outside of the home, and because of historical gender and racial discrimination in the sense that this is women's work and work for minorities, they are all across the board in pretty low quality jobs with low pay. But there are also things that, you know, workers outside of the caregiving space face at sort of every income level, I think, with, you know, there are entrenched gender roles around especially childcare. At the high income level, we talk a lot about the marriage penalty and the marriage bonus, but also in the tax code, the fact that if I go out into the labor force, earn cash, and use it to pay David to watch my child, I'm taxed and I pay it with post-tax dollars for David. If I stay home with my own child, I get to do it tax-free. And so there are all these sort of things that we don't necessarily think about because we view the kind of production and the kind of economic activity that goes on in the home as just fundamentally different from everything else. And it's treated differently by our tax code, it's treated differently by social policy. I think the way that we handle hunger is kind of an interesting example that, in a lot of places, food stamps and programs that are designed to deal with food insecurity are very focused on, in fact, they often have rules against prepared hot food, for example, because handing you a package of groceries is an appropriate thing for the government to subsidize, but dealing with the fact that you have to then, after work, before your kids starve, find a way to put that together into a meal is not an appropriate role for social policy. And, as we said, it's treated differently by the market. And a lot of our approach to the workplace, I think, is really predicated on workers having someone at home doing all of those things, even though that was kind of never true for most people, but it's become more and more out of sync with the way that people live their lives. And it's basically untenable in the modern world, where most households do not have someone at home doing all of the home production. So you have to either earn enough money to replace that home production with market labor, so to hire childcare and high-quality childcare that you're comfortable leaving your kid with for not just the 40 hours or more that you work, but also the commute. Or you have to figure out a way to provide it yourself. And families across the country have been struggling with these issues for a very long time, and they are problems that we have viewed historically as private problems, but that individuals and families can't solve on their own. So I think that there's an increasing recognition of that fact, and I'm here to talk about one very narrow piece of that, which is paid family and medical leave insurance. So the vast majority of people will become parents at some point in their lifetime, and even if you're not a parent, almost everyone will be faced with caregiving needs in their family and for their loved ones. I think historically we've viewed especially the childcare portion of this as a private choice that you then have to bear the costs and benefits of yourself, and that again is tied to the fact that we viewed it as something that women did in the home. But it's not a choice, it's a reality of workers' lives. And it has huge effects on women's ability to fully participate in the labor market because the expectation and the general outcome is still that women provide most of the caregiving in these situations. So women pay a big wage penalty for taking on family caregiving obligations, especially becoming a parent. They face this because of lost income during the caregiving, and then reduced workforce prospects after the caregiving. So evidence indicates that women who have access to paid maternity leave, for example, are more likely 6 months later to be back at work in a job with a similar title and similar pay, and often for the same employer, than women who do not have access to paid leave, because they take the appropriate amount of leave, they're able to use the monetary resources, the income replacement, to get their childcare in order, get their other household issues in order so that they're ready to go back to work. Also, there's a lot of kind of popping in and out of the labor force at a pretty critical point in many women's careers, and you pay a wage penalty for that. Your human capital degrades, you shift jobs. There's also, I was glad to hear occupational segregation brought up, because I think that's another piece that we haven't really explored as much empirically as we should, but some degree of occupational segregation is driven by women recognizing that they're going to have caregiving needs, and that some of these low-paid occupations that are predominantly identified with women do at least have some sense that most of their employees are caregivers, and so moving in, going to work for the nonprofit that has the good paid leave benefits instead of going to work for the entrepreneurial startup. These are the kinds of decisions that can shift women onto a lower earning path. we've had the Family Medical Leave Act for more than 20 years. That entitles you, if you're covered, which 40% of the workforce is not, to unpaid family medical leave, which is just untenable for low-wage workers and actually for most workers. As we've heard already, almost every other country in the world has some paid maternity leave at the very least. Most big industrialized countries have something far better than that. In addition to providing really important economic security for women across the income spectrum, I think that these policy decisions also have powerful effects on shaping the norms around caregiving in our society. And you see this in California. They've had paid family leave for about 10 years now, layered on top of an existing temporary disability and program that they've had for 4 decades, I think. And there they've seen increasing uptake each year of paternity leave. And as it's becoming normalized, and we see this in other workplaces, you can start to make a shift, because right now, economic reality is almost always going to trump individuals' preferences about equality in their marriage. And if you have a higher earning spouse and a lower earning spouse, and one of them needs to take time off to take care of someone, it's generally going to be the lower earning spouse, which is often the woman. So another reason that this is a great place for policies to step in is because there's an insurance function in addition to just redistribution, that some folks are going to get sick and others are not going to get sick. And it's really important that getting sick doesn't mean not only huge medical bills, which we're trying to deal with through healthcare reform, but also lost wages and inability to go back to the workforce. So, sorry. So we're working on this fight in DC. I work for a council member there. We've introduced a very exciting and progressive bill that deals with some of the problems that, in other states, the wage replacement rate is between 55 and 66%, including on the first dollar for a low-income person. That's just not going to work. You can't live on 2/3 of minimum wage. And we're hoping to get it passed this year. So my last second, I'll just give you a plug that you guys are also considering paid family and medical leave insurance in New York, and I can't tell you enough how valuable your input and your voice can be at the state and local level, which is where a lot of that government expenditure happens and a lot of the policy you care about happens. So get involved.
I do have a few slides. Oh, Anne is much taller than I am. Okay, how's that? I do have a few slides, so I will stand up here. So I'm really excited to be here today on behalf of the National Women's Law Center, which is a nonprofit in DC that works to break down barriers and expand opportunities for all women, but we have a particular focus on meeting the needs of low-income women and their families. And I really appreciate all the stage setting that Anne and Caroline and Kitty have done already today, because we also think it's very important to challenge sort of whether the popular narrative needs to be around whether women can have it all, and sort of the underlying assumption that they already have a lot. Because in reality, there's far too many women who are still struggling just to get by, especially, as Anne noted, single mothers. So I'm going to just quickly run through a little bit of data to illustrate just how many women I'm talking about. And then I'm going to turn to the question of policies, specifically tax policies, that actually can help women make ends meet and even get ahead. So first, I know Caroline has talked about the wage gap, and the next panel, including one of my colleagues, is going to get into that issue in depth, so I will not dwell on it here. But I do just want to re-emphasize that women typically earn less than men, and especially for women of color, wage gaps are very large and, of course, add up over a woman's lifetime, which puts them at a greater risk of economic insecurity, them as well as their families. And not unrelated to the wage gap, women are also more likely than men to live in poverty. Almost 15% of women, which is more than 18 million women, had incomes below the federal poverty line. And nearly 6 in 10 poor children live in families that are headed by women. Again, many of these women are working, but their wages are too low, and often their hours are too low to support themselves, not to mention their kids. In fact, nearly 70% of poor children, that's about 10.4 million, live in families where at least one person works. Next slide. And again, one of the major reasons that women earn less than men and are more likely to be poor is that women are far more likely than men to work in low-wage jobs. Often those jobs, as Katie mentioned, are jobs like childcare workers and home care workers and maids and housekeepers and waitresses in restaurants that are traditionally viewed as women's work, caregiving roles and serving roles. The jobs that I'm talking about specifically in this graph are those that typically pay less than $10.50 an hour. There are 23 million workers who hold these jobs, and 2/3 of them are women. So at $10.50 an hour, a mom with 2 children would earn about $21,000 a year, which is just over the federal poverty line for a family of 3. And full-time hours, of course, can be very hard to come by in many of these jobs because low-wage workers are far more likely to work part-time involuntarily than those in higher-wage jobs. And many of these jobs don't even pay $10.50 an hour. They pay the federal minimum wage, which is just $7.25, and that leaves a mom at an income of less than $15,000 a year. So not even close to enough to support a family. So the combination of inadequate pay and insufficient hours can really keep women and their families trapped in poverty. And all of that is really very depressing. But the good news is that there are policy solutions that make a difference. And some of my work at the Law Center focuses on employment side policies that would make those terrible jobs at least somewhat better, like raising the minimum wage and enacting fair scheduling policies. But today I'm going to talk about the other side, which is tax policies, some of which are already working to help improve outcomes for low-income women and their families. And I'm also going to talk about some improvements that could make our tax system even more effective as a tool to reduce poverty, since, as Anne noted, that is one of the major levers of social policy that we have in this country, for better or for worse. So 2 policies that I want to focus on first are the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit, so the EITC and the CTC. The EITC is refundable, and so is part of the CTC, which means that even families who have little or no federal income tax liability, which is the case for most low-wage workers, can still receive at least some of the credit as a refund. So it supplements their income on top of what they earn from work. The CTC is worth up to $1,000 per child, and the EITC can be worth quite a bit more. The maximum credit for this year is $6,242, which is what would apply to, say, a married couple family with 3 children and earnings between about $14,000 and $24,000 a year. And I'm not going to get into all of the eligibility parameters here, but it is important to know that these credits are very much targeted to low and sort of moderate income families. Another important piece to note is that the value of tax credits like the EITC and the CTC, you know, the $1, $2, $3, or $6,000 that families are getting from these credits are not actually counted towards the official poverty measure. So when I just spoke about how many women are living in poverty, that actually overestimates potentially a little bit the numbers of families who have incomes specifically below the federal poverty line, because some of the income that they receive from the government is not counted in that measure. But the Census Bureau has a supplemental poverty measure that does account for the value of these benefits. And that shows that the EITC and the CTC together, as you can see in the chart on the left, together lift more than 9 million people out of poverty, and they lift 22 million additional people closer to the poverty line. So it's not enough, but it certainly makes a difference for a very, very large number of families. The two tax credits together lift 5 million children out of poverty, which is more than any other program. And as an added bonus, there's been quite a bit of research done on these policies, specifically, or particularly the EITC, which has been around for a number of decades now. And that research consistently shows that these credits can encourage adults to work, and they can improve outcomes for children. A really kind of surprisingly long list of outcomes, which I won't get into all the details here, trying to keep an eye on the time, but overall, studies indicate that young children in low-income families who receive the type of income support that the EITC and the CTC provide tend to perform better in school, they're likelier to be born healthier, and even looking at long-term impacts, they're likely to work more hours as adults and also to earn more as adults. So again, a large, and it's a growing body of research shows that these credits work and they make a difference for women and for the children in their families. That said, the EITC and the CTC are not perfect, but they are more effective than they once were, thanks to improvements that were initially made in 2009. And I won't go into detail, but I do want to flag one that's particularly important for very low-income earners, which was to lower the amount of earnings that a worker needs to receive the child tax credit as a refund. So again, to receive the credit even when they have no tax liability, to receive it as additional income. And so that change lowered the amount of earnings a worker needed to receive the CTC as a refund to $3,000 a year. But that improvement, along with EITC improvements for married couples and for larger families, were set to expire next year in 2017. And if the CTC improvement that I just mentioned had expired, the earnings threshold would have jumped from $3,000 to $14,700 in 2017, meaning rather than the first $3,000 of income, the first $14,700 of income would not count at all towards the credit. So a single mom with a minimum wage job who earns $14,500 a year in a minimum wage job would see her child tax credit drop from $1,700 to $0. Fortunately, Congress, surprisingly, also I should say, reached a deal at the end of 2015 that made these improvements permanent. So on a permanent basis now, that earnings threshold for the child tax credit is $3,000 rather than closer to $15,000 and upward in later years. And it also made permanent some major corporate tax breaks, but the Law Center and our partners argued effectively, I think, that it was just really unconscionable for Congress to consider extending huge tax cuts for big business without, at a minimum, giving low-wage working families a break too. So that was one victory that we can count in a year that we were not expecting many big ones. Oh, whoops, I'm sorry. That was the slide on the EITC and CTC improvements. Okay. And I know I'm running out of time, but I will just quickly run through the work that we have ahead of us, because I want to talk about 2 additional improvements that would do even more. One to the EITC and one to a credit that we haven't talked about yet, which is the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit. So first, the EITC. I've talked a lot already about how the EITC benefits families with children, but for workers without children, the EITC really provides little or no benefit. And in fact, the federal workers without children are the one group where the federal tax system actually can push them into or deeper into poverty rather than helping them out of poverty. And in the budget released just last week, President Obama included a proposal to expand the EITC for childless workers that would really improve the credit by doubling the maximum credit amount, raising the amount of income that workers can earn and still be eligible for the credit, and also expanding the age range in which workers can qualify for the credit, making workers as young as 21 and as old as 66 eligible for the credit. And as the numbers on the slide illustrate, it would benefit millions of people, and I will not go into further detail about who those people are right now in the interest of time. Because I do want to get to this last slide, especially given all of the talk about the burden of caregiving responsibilities that falls disproportionately on single mothers and the costs of caregiving, especially for a mom who needs to go to work to support her family, but also needs to find a safe place for her kids while she's at work. So as many of you in this room might know on a personal level, I have a 2-year-old, so I certainly know myself that childcare is very expensive. On an annual basis, there's really a wide range in average costs depending on how old your child is and where you live and how many hours of care you need. But for full-time care, the cost ranges from about $4,000 a year to over $17,000 a year on average. So for many families, particularly low-income families and particularly single mother families, this is a huge expense. For working mothers of children under 5 with incomes below the poverty line, child care costs typically amount to 43% of their income, which of course leaves extremely little left for all of the other expenses that those families face. And the Child and Dependent Care Credit is meant to offset some of those costs, but the way it is designed makes it not really effective at all at doing so, especially for the lowest income families who could most use the assistance. The primary problem is that it is not refundable. So as the example on the slide illustrates, a low-income mom who is technically eligible of a credit of close to $2,000 would actually get no benefit from the credit at all because she doesn't have any tax liability. In addition, the expense limits have not been increased in 15 years and don't reflect the current costs of childcare. Right now, the credit is based on a percentage of the costs of up to $3,000 a year for one child and $6,000 a year for 2 or more children. But in most places, $3,000 a year is a few months of childcare, not a year. And in addition, the sliding scale that determines the amount of the credit is also extremely out of date and really low, so that it starts to, the maximum credit is only available for families who actually have incomes below the poverty line, and it phases down really quickly. And so I'm running out of time to go into detail about what we would propose to improve the credit, but essentially we'd like to see Congress address each of the problems that I just ran through by making the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit refundable, by increasing the percentage of expenses that families can claim towards the credit and increasing the expense limits, and indexing the expense limits and income levels on the sliding scale for inflation so that they won't erode over time as they have so far.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Good, really? Okay, that's better. My name is Joelle Gamble. I'm the National Director of the Roosevelt Network. And I must explain to you what the Roosevelt Institute does, because otherwise they would not allow me to be not working right now. I'm supposed to be uptown. So the Roosevelt Institute is inspired by the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor. The Roosevelt Institute reimagines America as it should be, a place where hard work is rewarded, everyone participates, and everyone enjoys a fair share of our collective prosperity. We believe that when the rules work against this vision, it's our responsibility to recreate them. And so we bring together thousands of thinkers and doers from a new generation of leaders in every state to Nobel laureates and economists, working to redefine the rules that guide our social and economic realities. So in short, that means that I am both a wonk and an organizer. It is my job to both think about policy and how we create policy change, but also to help organize other people to be able to realize that change themselves. And so I'm really excited about this panel because inequality and tackling inequality is something that's very important to us at the Roosevelt Institute. We essentially believe that runaway inequality is a choice. There's a 2014 IMF historical analysis that found that the combined direct and indirect effects of redistribution, including the growth effects of lower inequality, are on average pro-growth, and that there's no correlation between lower capital gains rates and improved investments. So for me, when I think about things like the tax code, when I think about fiscal policy, we shouldn't just be thinking about how much can people with money bear to support the rest of us, but instead, how can we build towards inclusive growth? How can we use fiscal policy to build towards inclusive growth and lift up everyone? And how can we use it to incentivize behaviors that we want and discourage ones that we don't want? So given that inequality is a choice, we think about policy as not just, its adverse effects, but instead from a values lens and from a lens of what is politically possible and what can be politically possible if the conversation was changed. So one thing that I think might be of interest to this group, I won't elaborate on some of the policies I had written down here because my fellow panelists have already so skillfully outlined them. I'm instead gonna focus on a report that might be of interest to you all in this room because it was built by folks who are your age. I work with young folks all across the country, 130 chapters, 40 states. And this past fall, we decided it'd be a good idea to try to survey 1,000 of them and crowdsource their ideas for 2016. Fortunately, what seemed like a Herculean task actually worked, and we ended up getting 1,000 folks to participate in this process from 160 cities and colleges, and we've just launched this report yesterday. And there's some things that I think are really important. It's important, one, because it's a generational agenda, but it's also important because we are in 2016. And as much as we want to get a perfect piece of policy passed, this Congress is not really passing very much. It doesn't even feel like they're listening. In fact, I was looking at the recess calendar and I was like, oh, are all those little blackout dates actually, when they're off? They're like, no, that's when Congress is in session. That's how ridiculous it is at this point. But also because our generation is actually gonna be very influential this election season. We are 1/3 of the workforce. We are actually young people are actually half of Latino voters, and everyone's trying to figure out how to court Latino voters. And we're 30.5% of all eligible voters. So it's really important to know what we think. And as the first panelist mentioned, we're gonna be most affected by rampant inequality. We're growing up in this economy where there aren't that many jobs. And so we crowdsourced this agenda from 1,000 young people. There were a lot of different issues, but the economy ultimately became one of those top three: the economy, education, and human rights. I don't separate those three things. I think they're actually very interconnected. But what I thought might be useful for this panel is to discuss what we found in the section on the economy. And we did something fun in which we asked folks to rank what was most important and then actually what's most practical. So that's where that what do we value and then what do we think is politically possible comes into play. So what was most important? Reforming the tax code. I think we surveyed a bunch of wonks, so they were like, tax code, yes. But in addition to the tax code, they wanted to build strong local economies. They wanted to counter the undue influence of the financial sector in the economy and then eradicate child poverty. So those are the things that people thought were the most important. And what they thought was the most practical was actually reform the tax code, build strong local economies, build worker power and improve working conditions, and then institutionalize family-friendly policies, which I think is really encouraging considering what we've been talking about today, that that's actually something that we think we're in a political environment where we can get something done. And so all of those things, we took what they thought was important, we took what they thought was practical, and then we laid out a set of policies that we think should be worked on both in the federal government, but also in state and local communities across the country. So I wanted to share some of those with you all. Some of them are strictly federal, and you can make that inference, and some of them are actually adaptable to the local level. Actually, one I think would be relevant to you all here at NYU. So we talked about, and we proposed, or are proposing, a tax system that reduces the actions of overly risky activity by passing a financial transaction tax and creating a financial infrastructure exchange. That's a big one. Don't really see that happening in 2016, but it's important that we start talking about what that looks like because of the overdue influence that the financial sector has on the economy. We also talked about a carbon tax, and that speaks to what I was saying earlier about, creating a tax system that actually de-incentivizes behaviors that we don't like or we don't want, but also generates revenue. We talked about increasing the minimum wage, and then also closing domestic loopholes with an eye to eliminating laws that benefit corporations' bottom lines. So essentially, a lot of folks are like, okay, some people are benefiting a lot from the tax code, and way, way, way too many people are not benefiting from the system as it stands, and so we want to correct that balance, in essence. And I think that correcting the balance in those ways actually opens up the possibility for conversations around a lot of the policies that my fellow panelists outlined. But something that I think we're also proposing that makes a lot of sense for you all at NYU is we want to actually incentivize local and state governments to set benchmarks for engagement with women and minority-owned businesses, and also look at the roles in which universities can play in actually encouraging the development of those. NYU is one of the wealthiest universities in the country. I'm sure you know, you actually have to pay tuition to them. And it's sitting in what is now a very nice part of New York. And there's a question of, since we are giving universities tax-exempt status, what is the public benefit, right, that universities are providing? There is, of course, educating our workforce, but what are some other ways in which universities can actually help their surrounding communities? So a number of chapters in our network have actually been working with their universities, some folks at NYU, folks at Michigan, a lot of schools that have large endowments, but also have a huge influence on their surrounding community, to look at how they spend their endowments and how they do procurement. One way that folks at University of Michigan are working on this is they're working with their school to have them build out better relationships with minority and women-owned businesses in their surrounding community. Congress may not pass a whole bunch of laws that we want to see, but NYU could actually work to help minority and women who are running businesses in the New York City area. And so I thought that was something that I wanted to put out there for you all, smart, ingenuitive people, to challenge your university to think about how you can actually help people who are living and working and making a livelihood around where you live. And the reason why I give you all a call to action is because that's the other part of what I do. Outside of thinking about just what policies we want, we have to figure out how to actually implement them, and I want to empower more and more young people to be able to do that. So the cool thing about Roosevelt is, like I said, we have emerging thinkers and doers, folks who are on college campuses, along with Nobel laureate economists like Joe Stiglitz, and we're working intergenerationally to create this kind of change, which means we have a high-level media strategy, a high-level strategy in which we're working with members of Congress, going through those traditional institutional routes to be able to create change. But we also work with folks where they're at in their local communities, training them on how to do advocacy work, training them how to write policy memos, training them to lobby their own legislators to pass their own ideas. In fact, you mentioned a DC hearing last week for City Council. Several of our members actually testified at that paid sick leave hearing, which was really cool from our GW chapter. But those are the kinds of things that, even if you don't feel like you have the wherewithal to go and testify before Congress right now, you could do right now. You could testify before New York City Council. That's totally possible. She mentioned that that's something that New York City is working on, so I say do it. Because you don't have to wait that long to actually be able to create change. I mean, you may have to wait until you finish an exam or finish your reading, because I know y'all have hella work to do. But that doesn't mean that you can't start to create change now. So that's what I wanted to say.
Those witnesses were amazing. I remember those three witnesses.
Yeah.
They were fantastic.
So I thought I might open it up with a question to the panel regarding the kinds of policies and tools that are most effective in trying to affect the kind of change that a number of panelists were talking about, and why you sometimes use one versus another. So specifically, this panel is about tax and to some degree transfer policy. But one can imagine a number of the areas that the panelists have talked about, there are other tools, and I imagine some of the later panels will be talking about them. So when it comes to paid family and medical leave, in the 1990s, they used a regulatory tool to try to begin to establish family leave. And the tool that Kitty's talking about involves taxes and transfers. When it comes to childcare, there's, the DCTC on the tax side. On the other hand, there's a child care block grant which goes through on the spending side and sort of involves a very different tool. So as a panel that's sort of focused on taxes and then to some degree transfers, I'm just curious for the panelists' opinions about what is the proper role for tax and transfers. Do we use it primarily as a political means when other things would be better, or is it actually the best way of trying to affect some of the changes that people desire?
Well, I'll jump in. I think there are two distinct questions there, one of which I can answer and the other, maybe another panelist wants to dive in. One is, when do you use fiscal policy versus regulatory policy? And the other is, when should you use taxes versus spending? Because those things get very muddled. I think, family and medical leave insurance is an example of a place where I think you need both pieces. So job protection is an incredibly important piece of being sure that you can actually take leave when you need it. But it is also true that being able to get paid is an incredibly important piece. And this is one place where I think there is actually some difference when you're looking at business size and other business characteristics, where when you're really trying to provide social insurance, having a big pool that's not tied to individual employers being able to pay you your full salary while you're out on leave, or not be able to pay your full salary while you're out on leave, an insurance model run by the government based on taxes probably makes a lot of sense. And you're trying to do some redistribution, so you can, key your tax rates and your benefits in that way to be sure that you're really providing the safety net for low-income people. So I think you need kind of both halves. But then there's this separate question of, okay, like childcare, I think is a good example. Should we be doing it through the tax code or not?
So, it's a really interesting question why we have, these sort of set of benefits in the tax code. I think there are a whole bunch of different answers at play. One is historically the United States. I mean, we have a pretty minimal welfare state, right? And even the word welfare state in the United States, progressives don't like it if I use that term, which in Europe would be a perfectly fine thing to say. But we have been conditioned to think that the welfare state is a bad thing. That tells us something about us, right? So because we have in our politics, our libertarian politics, vilified the state, our state has not created the capacity that it should have, really, or that other countries have anyway, to administer dignified, universal, helpful programs to people. Instead, what we have is we have dignified universal programs for old people. That's Social Security, and that was a historical thing. But for women, for families, for children, we do not have an administrative state, federal or state or local. Those programs have always been minimally funded. They have been administered with deliberate efforts to shame people and to turn them away at the door. And so we don't have an existing apparatus. Now, the tax piece of it is actually also funny. There's another contributing factor, which is sort of the configurations of American politics. If you look in the last 20, 30 years or so, you have people on the right who are very, very anti-tax, right? In the United States in general, we're very anti-tax. We somehow think that tax dollars just go up the chimney and smoke. They don't do anything. It's just money out of our pockets. That's the way we talk about taxes in the United States, right? Money out of our pocket is a terrible thing. Government taking our money, right? And so, whereas, those of us who are progressives tend to think that government can, if well supervised and well run and with good oversight, can actually do good things with our tax dollars. So the compromise that's been reached so often and over again in the last generation has been, let's run things through the tax code, because something like, say, the dependent care tax credit, which, Kitty's completely right, it needs to be refundable. But let's run something like the child tax credit, the EITC, the DCTC, the child care thing, through the tax code. Why? Because the Republicans can vote for it because it's a tax cut. Right? Because it comes off your taxes, they can call it a tax cut. And they're not raising anybody's taxes, that awful thing. Okay? And progressives can get behind it because the tax cut that it actually gives goes to people that have, it's good social policy as well. So that's kind of a rough and ready explanation of why we have it. Is it good or is it bad? I think it depends on the baseline. Is the baseline current administration of something like the Child Care Block Grant? I think there are still waiting lists almost everywhere for those funds. The Child Care Block Grant is a thing that is supposed to give child care funding in an expenditure way, not a tax way, in an expenditure way to low-income working families, to families who are transitioning off of public assistance and stuff like that. But there's not enough funding. It's a block grant. So another nice thing about tax is there's no cap on the funding of it, right? We don't have a waiting list for the EITC. If you have the income, you have the kids, and you file a return, you get it. And so that's another, again, it's not an ideal situation. The EITC has drawbacks, but it's not particularly stigmatized because it's a private transaction between you and the government, right? To get the EITC, I don't have to go into a welfare office and prove that I live where I say I do and prove that I have kids and prove that they live with me. I don't have to do that. I just have to file a relatively dignified form, and my check comes to me as privately as your check comes to you, and so on. I also don't have to take a day off of work to go and sit in the welfare office. So there are definitely good sides to tax-based administration. There are downsides too. I don't know about you guys, but I'm definitely in favor of increasing the EITC. I think that it could do, in the ways that we were talking about, that Julie was talking about, we could do more via the EITC to really improve the lives of low-income workers with and without children and so on. But one of the barriers we face is that the EITC is paid in a lump sum at the end of the year. And so when you're talking about, as Julie was saying, you're talking about somebody that earns maybe $15,000 or $20,000 a year, and then they get a lump sum of $5,000, $6,000. I'd love to see it be $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, $10,000. It's kind of a mixed blessing because some people who get the EITC really like that it comes in a lump sum because it's like forced savings, right? You get this big thing, and then at the end of the year, you can do big stuff that you can't otherwise do, like maybe buy a car or get new boots for the kids, all the kids at the same time or whatever. But if we think about increasing the EITC, if you're talking about $10,000 or something like that, I think we need to think about ways of getting into people's pockets earlier, at least part of it. It can be done. It hasn't been done. But that's just an example of a place where tax administration, for all of its good parts, also has some limitations. There are solutions, but we just need to craft them.
Sure, I would just chime in to add that at the National Women's Law Center, we definitely take a both-and perspective on a lot of these issues. In addition to some of the proposal in President Obama's budget that I mentioned about the EITC, for example, that budget also include a really significant increase in the Child Care and Development Block Grant that funds the direct child care assistance program. It would increase it by $82 billion, which would go a long way to actually make just subsidized child care available to a much larger pool of families, which is particularly important in light of the fact that Congress passed a bill to improve that program in 2014 that made some really important changes to improve the health and safety of kids in child care, to improve performance standards, to help make child care more stable for low-income families by, for example, guaranteeing that once a child is deemed eligible for the program, that he cannot be considered ineligible for at least 12 months. All of these things are great, but that improvements bill was accompanied by exactly $0 in additional federal funding. And so state budgets are going to be really strained in states who, as Ann said, already have long waiting lists in most places. They're going to be stretched even further trying to meet the requirements, the new requirements, while also serving kids and families who really need assistance. So, we would like to see really significant investments to expand that kind of assistance, but also think that the child care independent tax credit improvements could help fill in the gaps, particularly for for moderately higher income families who maybe still wouldn't qualify for a direct subsidy, but for whom childcare expenses are really still a very significant chunk of their income. On the EITC, for example, we would advocate for making improvements in the EITC, but also raising the minimum wage. It is interesting always to hear when the subject of raising the minimum wage comes up, suddenly support from a small majority in Congress for the EITC becomes more vocal than it's ever been, because they say, well, you don't need to raise the minimum wage, just expand the EITC. We really think you need both. Although I will note that actually the childless worker expansion that is proposed in President Obama's budget is very, very similar to a proposal that House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan made in his anti-poverty plan. So again, as we've talked about, the political appetite for doing things through the tax code is much greater than direct spending, and so we will work where we can to actually accomplish incremental change when the bigger goals that we have are still a little bit out of reach.
So we're running short of time, but I thought we would see if we can at least fit in one question from the audience.
How many people take advantage of the EITC program now? I know it's been around for at least 30 years, and it's, it strikes me that one of the disadvantages for some but also an advantage is because it's part of the tax code and you don't earn enough to necessarily file income tax. You have to know about it and know to do it, and that takes a pretty sophisticated person or some pretty good advocates to help that whole community. So what is how effective is it at actually reaching people that it's meant to reach in reality?
Do you know the latest stuff on this?
I don't know the number offhand, but I will say with the EITC, I think because it has been around for so many years at this point, the public awareness of that, and because it can potentially be worth so much, the public awareness and public advocacy around the EITC, I think, has grown quite a lot, and it is one that probably has a higher take-up rate than almost anything else.
Yeah, and then it once did. So, I'm old enough to know the actual history of this for the last 30 years. When the EITC first started to become a major, but it's been around since 1975, but not until about 1990 was it a major part of welfare reform, and really, has grown into the largest federal program for working age families. Some wonderful, a bunch of advocacy groups took on exactly the task that you spotted, because before 1990 it was a very funny kind of program, because people at this income level weren't used to filing their taxes. Why would they? And so advocates did a wonderful job of posters and community outreach and all kinds of stuff. So I think at this point, I don't have the numbers either, the most recent numbers, but I think due to outreach, it is now something that's part of people's vocabulary. They know what it is. And of course, in the American capitalist system, we have H&R Block that saw that there was money to be made by helping the advocates publicize it. And so, that helped too.
So I think we are up a little bit against time. We're going to do one more question.
I just want to make a comment. I think that the credit is great, and I think that there are people taking it. But a really big problem that I have is some of the low-income people who are getting this credit, entitled to this credit, also have student loans, and they're seizing the credit. And it's very disconcerting when you have a family that really needs this money. Their income is generally seized by the student loan to begin with, and then this money goes to pay off their student debt. I really would love to see that money go to pay the kids and help out with the kids. I don't know if you could stop it from being seized by other creditors, but not student loan, please. So if you could add that
We'll add that to the list.
somehow.
All right. Well, with that, we're at time. So I wanted to thank the panelists here for a great panel, and thank you.